Okay, this is a deconstruction of part 2, chapter 5. And we really get a sense of the process of change and transformation of Merceau from the beginning of part 1 all the way up to the end of part 2, the end of the novel. And this idea of the change in Merceau's character, where in part 2, as part of the process of change and transformation, he becomes much more self-reflective and self-analytical. And we have this quotation, "I think, therefore I am," this idea where he comes into kind of a consciousness and existence through his self-reflection. The loss of intellectual interest is like Merceau's way of adjusting to his imprisonment, so masterfully presented in chapter 2 of part 2. But Merceau's final attitude is astonishingly different, at least superficially, from what we know in part 1. It seems like a profound conversion. He becomes passionately, defiantly committed to his own idea of existence. "I was pouring everything out at him from the bottom of my heart. I was sure of myself, sure of everything, surer than he was, sure of my life and sure of death that was coming to me. Yes, that was all I had, but at least it was a truth which I had hold of, just as it had hold of me." This is not the behaviour of a young man who seemed to take everything as it came along. He claims in his final outburst at the chaplain that he had a premonition of this apparently new attitude in his earlier years. "It was as if I'd been waiting all along for this very moment, in the depths of my future, throughout the whole of this absurd life I'd been leading. It felt a vague breath drifting towards me across all the years that were still to come." At this moment, Merceau has been provoked by the conventional and uncomprehending chaplain. The process of change has been a gradual one, stretching over 11 months, but only takes an hour to read in a very sparse way Camus chooses to present it. Merceau's imprisonment begins with a feeling of unreality. He does not take his imprisonment seriously. It is no more real to him than the killing. He recognises that he had not yet learnt to think like a prisoner. "When I was first imprisoned, though, the worst thing was I kept thinking like a free man," he tells us at the beginning of part 2. He is so unconscious of what prison really means that he childishly complains it's unfair, that he cannot have the company of women. He comes to realise the essence of being a prisoner, namely that he is being punished, something that most prisoners never actually manage. He is commended for his new attitude by the chief warden. Prison now becomes unbearable, so he makes himself adjust. It is a kind of self-re-education. He grows aware of the value of each individual sensation, and even more importantly, the value of each memory from his past. So far does he go in the process that he claims that a man who'd only lived for a day could easily live 100 years in prison. He'd have enough memories not to get bored. Yet the process is not an easy one. The entire process of adjustment is repeated in concentrated form after his death sentence. At first, Merceau plays the idea of escape. The vital thing was that there was a chance of escaping, that hope was being shot down at the street corner in full flight. And later, what was wrong with a guillotine was that you had no chance of it at all. He knows, of course, that this is ridiculous, but it's a clear sign that he has not accepted his death yet, just as he did not accept his imprisonment at first. Intellectually, Merceau decides how to deal with death soon afterwards. Given that you've got to die, it obviously doesn't matter exactly how or when. Emotionally, however, he is clearly not at ease with this, as he still plays the idea of being pardoned and tends to become excited about it. "I'd have to do my best to remain calm, even about this hypothesis, in order to make my resignation to the first one, death, more plausible." What brings about the final emotional change is the visit of the chaplain, whom Merceau had refused to see, but who enters his cell against Merceau's will. Eventually the chaplain provokes a reaction described in physical terms. "Something exploded inside me." Here there is a parallel to the powerful reaction to the son just before killing. That was when everything shook, at the end of part 1, chapter 5. The conversation before this point is worth examining closely. After the first slight shiver, Mousseau surprisingly finds the chaplain quite pleasant. Despite this, Mousseau makes no attempt to pretend to agree with him as he had done with the examining magistrate, and his replies are calm but frank. Clearly, Mousseau's openness irritates the chaplain. He made an irritated gesture, and to some extent he may be intending to do so. The chaplain says, in his opinion, we are all condemned to death. Mousseau chooses to object. This wasn't the same thing, and that anyway, this could never be any consolation, apparently forgetting his earlier statement, which seems to be in agreement with the chaplain's view. The chaplain's next question, do you believe in the belief that you are to die outright? His next ploy shows a total lack of thought. It's as if he is going through an automatic routine. Despite knowing that Mousseau does not believe in a god or in an afterlife, he attempts to convince Mousseau that he needs to think of divine justice, even if Mousseau was pardoned by the court, which he felt certain would happen. Mousseau's reply shows how totally different their conceptions are. Mousseau has no feeling of guilt. He merely has to accept the judgment of the court, which has, perversely, declared him guilty. The chaplain's exasperation grows. He tries an emotional ploy, evoking the suffering he imagines Mousseau has gone through, implying that Jesus was present through those sufferings. Mousseau's reply is unshakenly frank and honest as ever. He had only ever thought of Marie, and now even that was over. The last resort of the chaplain is to show compassion by asking if he may kiss Mousseau. Mousseau's rejection of his preaching and his attempt to show compassion provokes a sort of outburst, getting in ahead of Mousseau, who is about to tell him to go away. The chaplain comes up with nothing new, but Mousseau is patient with him, even willing to talk. I made one last attempt to explain. The routine banality of the response, you can't see that because your heart is blind, I shall pray for you, releases Mousseau's own violent reaction. So carried away is that he reaches the point of choking. Yet afterwards he feels calm and serene, and after sleeping, wakes in a state of serenity. The effect of the confrontation with the chaplain is to convince Mousseau emotionally as well as intellectually of the rightness of his attitude. The intensity of the confrontation, like the intensity of the mood before the killing, leads to a feeling of release or catharsis. The success of the novel depends very much on whether Camus succeeds in involving the reader sufficiently to be convinced by the suddenness of the change. On a purely analytical level, however, there is no real surprise in the way Mousseau develops. Indifference made Mousseau a misfit in society. But this very quality helps him eventually to feel at ease in a fraternal relationship with the uncaring, indifferent universe. It must be stressed that this is not the rejection of others' suffering that we would most often think of when we use the word indifferent, but rather an attitude of knowing that nothing has absolute or eternal importance, or put more positively, everything and everyone is of equal importance. Camus has two goals. He wishes to make a philosophical statement, and at the same time he wants to create a credible character who grows from an apparently insignificant clerk of very limited experience into a person who goes to his death convinced he has lived life to the full. The reader then must decide whether he has succeeded. Taking a closer look at the text itself, we have the first encounter with the chaplain. In the first highlighted line, and the second, note Mousseau's passion, an outburst of both fury and happiness, because he's convinced in the rightness of his belief, that the truth is on his side. He seems so cocksure, you see. The chaplain's certainties about God and the afterlife are worthless because Mousseau asserts they are false. No one can know these things for certain, and the uncertainty renders them meaningless. Living as he did, like a corpse, he couldn't even be sure of being alive. The chaplain is not really living life to the fullest, enjoying the sensual pleasure that Massot gets from life. Rather, the chaplain ignores the sensual while waiting in a solemn expectation for an afterlife that may not exist. In the next line, actually I was sure of myself, sure about everything, far surer than he, sure of my present life and of the death that was coming. Massot is right about life's meaninglessness, given the certainties of the existences of God, an ultimate judge of man's actions, and of a pleasurable afterlife that, according to Church, must be earned. In the next part of the narrative, Camus shows that all choices are meaningless and nothing matters in life because nothing will change the outcome, i.e. death, the only certainty. Massot depicts death metaphorically as a dark wind that levelled whatever was offered me. The knowledge of death destroyed everything for him, his ambition, his long-term feelings for others. All that he is able to enjoy, it seems, are momentary, sensual pleasures that are not lasting, just as life is not lasting. He denies the deep feelings of serious relationships, such as familial love and marriage, because their seeming permanence is an illusion. The knowledge of the inevitability of death makes the normal sadness people feel about the passing of a loved one meaningless, because everybody dies. A mother's love is meaningless because nothing lasts, and because that love is still not powerful enough to prevent Massot's death. So what good is it, really? Massot's death preoccupation makes him profoundly self-centred, as life has no meaning outside of his existence, which is the definition of absurdism. People choose their lives, but they only think that they have control over their fate. The truth is that everyone has the same fate, i.e. death. Again, Massot's tone suggests that he resents being called a brother, just as he has resented the priest in Maman's funeral and the chaplain in the jail calling him my son, and the chaplain's wanting to be called father. This is an indication of Massot's deep feelings of isolation, as others do not share his views. His beliefs alienate him from society. Life is a privilege, just as it is. No afterlife is necessary for Massot to appreciate it. Since we're all going to die, and since we can't know if our mortality is being judged, when and how you die, and issues such as sin and reputation are meaningless. In the last paragraphs of the novel, Massot shows his acceptance of the absurdist idea that the universe is indifferent to human life that lacks order. He doesn't realise this until he accepts his death, and this is the final change, the final step in the development of his consciousness, where he sees life with a past, present and future. An absolute contrast to chapter 2, where he only considered from the paper the yesterday and tomorrow. As we've seen from the extract before, the chaplain provokes a physical reaction in Massot, similar to the killing of the Arab. The sentences highlighted emphasise the sensual pleasure Massot obtains from being alive. The poetic use of metaphor emphasises the pleasure he experiences. The sirens are apparently from the jail announcing executions. In saying that dying people are departing for a world that meant nothing to him, Massot is asserting that, even if in fact an afterlife exists, he refuses to value it because of the uncertainty he has of it. All he values is this life, of which he can be certain. The key word here is played. Maman is able to play at the beginning again, because now that near death, she can relax about it and happily ignore it. Massot has been tortured by the consciousness of death, and thus unable to play and enjoy more than pleasure. Maman is free by her proximity to death. It becomes more enjoyable, suddenly worth living, which is something that Massot has not felt in his life. Life felt burdensome to him, poisoned by the dark wind. The idea of the brink of freedom is contrast to the image of entrapment in prison, the metaphor for societal expectation and judgment. Any meaning that he finds in life, he must create himself. Now that he's finally vocalised the truth about death that has haunted his whole life, he feels cleansed. He also says that despite everything he has stated about the consciousness of death's inevitability, he nevertheless clung to the futile hope that he would somehow be spared. The signs and stars in the night sky are perhaps part of the word's gentleness, as they are beautiful and poetic, creating for humanity the illusion of hope. Mousseau asserts, however, that the world is ultimately indifferent to the fates, problems and behaviour of humans. No one is watching out for you. The only thing truly fated is death. Meanwhile, Mousseau, saying that he opened up, emphasises that his upset over the knowledge of death has shut him off for his feelings. He has kept himself closed up in a shell, isolated from the world as well as other people. The world's ultimate indifference to humans echoes the indifference that Mousseau has demonstrated to everyone around him throughout the novel. Thus, alienated from society and insulted when the priest and chaplain call him son, Mousseau feels a kinship with the natural world, in which he takes such sensual pleasure, and is willing to embrace it like a brother. Mousseau acknowledges the pleasure he has felt in living, despite the burden of the consciousness of death, and now, close to death and with the absolute certainty that there is no hope of reprieve from his death sentence, he, like Maman at the end of her life, feels released from this burden, happy and free. The last sentence of the novel emphasises both Mousseau's loneliness and alienation from society. For society, death is the destruction of the monster, or a monster, of Mousseau and his indifference, and therefore the threat to the fabric of society. Here he understands his position in society.